Hello, and welcome to Things We Said Today, our weekly podcast about anything and everything to do with the Beatles as a group, as solo artists, past, present, things to come, and sometimes unofficial things, which is what we're talking about today. I'm Alan Kozin, the author of The Beatles from the Cavern to the Rooftop, and Got That Something, How the Beatles, I Want to Hold Your Hand, Changed Everything, and a writer on music for the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, and various other publications. And I'm joined by my two esteemed co-hosts, Ken Michaels, who you know as the host of the syndicated Beatles radio show Every Little Thing. Hello, Ken.
Hey, Alan. Hey, everybody.
And Steve Marinucci, who we like to call the world's only full-time Beatles reporter. You can read his work in Billboard.com, Axis.com, that's AXS.com, and in Variety and Goldmine, and he's adding new publications all the time. Hello, Steve. How you doing?
Hey, Alan. I'm fine. Hello, everyone.
So today's topic is going to be one of my favorite topics, bootlegs. And we've each chosen 5 of them, theoretically. We probably will mention some others. And we are trying to mix group and solo so that the whole field is covered. But before we get to that, we have some news items. Mostly to do with the Harrison family. So, Steve?
Well, tonight in Los Angeles, Danny Harrison is playing his first solo gig at the Echo, which is, I understand, sold out. But also today is the 20th anniversary of the John Fugelsang VH1 George Harrison Ravi Shankar performance, which, I mean, anybody who saw that, that's a hard one to forget. It was a beautiful... that was fantastic. Mm-hmm. But I'm astonished that it's 20 years ago on this day, on the date that we're taping, the July 24th. So,
okay.
Wow.
And that broadcast launched more than a few bootlegs itself, actually.
Right.
Our first hearing of any road. So,
mm-hmm.
Yeah. That's true.
That's right.
And in fact, I had just read that John Fugelsang said that originally it was just going to be like maybe 10, 15 minutes of an interview to promote Ravi Shankar's album. But they didn't expect it to be what it became. And, the questions were really, I guess, supposed to revolve around the Ravi Shankar album, Chants of India. But they had George there, and so one thing led to another. I had seen from this quote from John Fugelsang that they were kind of whispering into his ear, ask him questions about John Lennon. and John Fugelsang thought, well, George, when we talk about the Beatles so much, he wanted to get him to talk about God and spirituality and the things that George loves to talk about, which he did. Mm-hmm. And it was really a wonderful interview for something that wasn't fully planned.
Yeah.
The way it was pulled off was kind of miraculous. Mm-hmm. And the fact that we got Any Road, an earlier version of it, although we didn't know at the time. And he also did All Things Must Pass. Mm-hmm. I'm trying to remember what John Fugelsang said to him. He said, play anything, play ABBA. I think he said something to that effect. But that was a great interview.
Yeah, it was a good show. It should come out on disc or stream or whatever they have these days. It should be out officially. I wish they could arrange that somehow, but
right.
I have a feeling if they could have, they would have by now, but you never know.
Right.
Okay, and we talked about Danny's one of Danny's tracks is actually out there as a teaser.
That's right.
Either of you want to talk about that?
Yeah. The name of the song is called All About Waiting.
Mm-hmm.
It's about 5 minutes long. It's got a very strong electronic feel to it. Very catchy, very commercial to me, very repetitious with the chorus, and I love the sound of Danny's voice especially. Mm-hmm. I think it has potential if it gets airplay.
Yeah.
Do you think it'll get airplay?
There's no way to predict that, but judging how the Beatles' sons are treated on the radio, no.
Yeah.
Just to be realistic about it, I think that James McCartney's last album, had some real worthwhile material on it. In fact, a lot of his stuff deserves it. I think a lot of what Julian's put out and Sean's put out deserves some airplay. It definitely would fit, the modern rock format, but radio really hasn't been that receptive to any of them. Not since the days of Julian in his early years.
Right. I would think, though, that if any of them had potential to get airplay, it would be Danny.
Well, what about the Claypool Lennon Delirium? I would have thought should have got some, given that it's not just Sean. It's, there's
Les Claypool.
Yeah. Well, I did see one particular chart where it was listed, but I didn't see it in Billboard. And I do look at Billboard when these releases come out, and I didn't see it there. And there's a few modern rock stations that I listen to, and I didn't hear it on those. I don't know if it's fair to judge on just a couple of radio stations, but I don't think it got a lot of airplay.
Yeah. Danny's track has, that electronic drum going on for a lot of it, not all of it. It sort of disappears by the end. I think on one hand might get it some airplay because it sounds very contemporary. On the other hand, I can see his dad up there wagging his finger at him because this is the kind of sound that I think he was talking about in, when he's always talking about MIDI and drum machines and all that as being, something that wasn't for him. So on one hand, it's great that Danny, influenced as he is by his father's music, which you can hear in this song, nevertheless is doing what he wants to do, regardless of he's not following his father's rules necessarily.
Yeah. The new number 2 didn't get, to my recollection, didn't get any airplay at all.
No, they didn't.
And that was, those were a little further out. I would assume they were a little further out than what Danny's doing now. So, they were definitely a niche group, I guess, if you could say so.
Well, they really have an electronic sound too, very similar to what Danny's doing here.
Mm-hmm.
So, I don't see this as that big a departure myself. But then this is only one song I'm judging on.
Did either of you see the new number 2 live?
No.
I did. I saw them. They were in San Francisco, and I saw them. And I thought they were much better live than they were on record. But that's, so who knows? And I wouldn't be at all surprised if the recording from tonight or something from his live shows pops up somewhere. So,
incidentally, since
yes.
Alan, I know that, Alan, you heard the new song from Danny. Is there anything in there that sounds familiar to you?
The melodic contours are a little Georgie to me.
Yeah.
I would expect that.
Yeah, but what do you have in mind, Ken?
There's a song lyric. He actually used a lyric that was in Flying Hour from George, and I'm trying to remember if it's past it is gone and future may not be at all. But there is a line there from Flying Hour if you listen. It's said one time. Listen carefully.
Okay.
I'll have to go back and play it, but it's in there.
Okay. The only other thing I noticed in the news this week was there was a Jeff Emmerich interview in Variety, and his clip talking about Sgt. Pepper has been wandering around the internet, but this also was an interview about Pepper, and while there's certain amount of what Jeff Emmerich says I take with a grain of salt, in this case, I was struck by the fact that he objected to a lot of the talk about the new Pepper release in terms of everyone saying that not as much time was spent on the stereo mix as the mono mix. And that's an argument that I made as well right here, I believe, and also in my Beatle fan version of the review, that, first of all, we don't really know in terms of minutes how much time they spent, but we can see from the listings in Lewison's book that they did, either mix the stereo do the stereo mixes at the same time as the mono mixes, or in some cases they did them later, but in almost every case there were multiple stereo mixes of each song. So, I never really bought that idea of, they just tossed the stereo mixes off, and I was sort of happy to hear Jeff Emmerich say that because, that's something I think he would remember. And just adding that to the mix here. If anyone's still pondering that stereo mono issue with Sgt. Pepper.
That's interesting because, I mean, that gives a little more legitimacy to the stereo mixes, which I've always liked. I mean, but yeah, so that's good. That's good to hear.
Yeah, I saw that too. I saw that in the interview, and I immediately thought of you, Alan.
Okay, so bootlegs. Let me say.
Wait. I thought we were going to talk about Paul's set list.
Oh,
yeah.
Okay.
Remember.
Okay, and finally, we thought we would have a brief Paul set list watch in so long as he's on tour. And anything to report, guys?
No, nothing. Nothing. Really, nothing. I mean, he's just all he's doing is he's changed the second and fourth songs seem to be the songs where he makes the changes, and all it's been is Save Us and Letting Go and Junior's Farm and Jet between the four shows I have in my hand. In one show, he did the show at Omaha. He did throw in Get Back instead of Birthday. But other than that, he's not making a whole lot of changes. Anyone looking for lots of changes is going to be very disappointed. Very disappointed.
Yeah, I've been checking with every show, and it's not surprising me. I have a feeling that after he has his break and he starts playing in the Northeast in September, that hopefully there'll be some changes by then. But most of the coverage of this tour has been so positive in just the reviews. I mean, everybody is raving about his shows. And
that isn't all that surprising. I mean, they're always the newspaper stories I've seen have always been pretty positive because everybody is so floored by seeing him and seeing 3 hours worth of songs and the fact that he's still doing it.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I mean, and it is a good show. That's there's not a question there. But I've seen the reviews too, and everybody, between Beatlemania and everything else. I mean, the reviews have been very positive.
Yeah, and it should be. I mean, he's giving you the best that he can, and you couldn't ask for more. It's just the only thing that we really, are being critical of is the set list.
Right, is the thing, and the voice, which the reviews aren't really touching. The reviews aren't really talking about the voice. They're just saying how great the show is, which is fine.
Even Bill King, I read his review, and he said, there were a couple of weak spots in his voice, but for the most part, the show was wonderful, just the way it was. So
anyway,
we're probably overly critical.
Okay, so we got bootlegs to talk about.
Yep.
And in fact, actually, a couple of things to say just in general about bootlegs. I mean, first of all, the bootleg world is a completely different place now than it was when it started in the late 60s, 1969 or so, when, those first couple of Get Back bootlegs came out. And now, Paul's shows, pretty much as soon as he plays them, they're out there, Ringo shows a little bit less, but there is a huge representation of them too. And this is the same for artists across the board. I mean, Dylan too, day or two after he plays a show, it's up there on the web somewhere. Having said that, we officially don't know where you can find these things. We don't sell them. We don't give them away. We don't know where you can find them, so don't ask us because we couldn't tell you. But you can learn to use Google. That's all I can say,
There you go.
Because the other thing that's happened actually is the rise of desktop bootlegging. Now that everyone has a computer and, sophisticated software, less sophisticated software, pretty much what people are doing are, they're just making bootlegs themselves. Either they've gone to a show and taped it and put it right up on the net, or, there's a lot of post-production going on. A bootleg will come out, or there will be, 50 favorite bootlegs from the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and people listen to them and say, I can speed correct that, I can EQ that, I can make that sound better. And so people are, and also the other thing people is compiling. There's, we have outtakes from, say, Rubber Soul scattered on 15 different bootlegs. Let's put them all together, that kind of thing. So, there's an awful lot going on. You can do it yourself if you have all these tracks, and often upgrades come around anyway. So I don't know, to me, it's a really exciting world. There was a very long time in which I listened to bootlegs much more than I listened to the commercial records, because I'd already heard the commercial records 8 gazillion times. And bootlegs were something new and different. And, and I think the artists recognize it too. I mean, lest, Universal come to me and say, hey, Kozin, what are you doing? When I interviewed Paul McCartney in 1990, probably, we talked about bootlegs, and he said he collects bootlegs and he tapes other people's concerts. And he says, in fact, he doesn't mind a good bootleg if it's got, some charisma and,
Didn't he come? Well, yeah, but didn't he walk that comment back at one point? I mean, after he said it.
I don't know,
because I think that got tossed back at him, and he walked it back a little bit because of what he'd said. What
he said to me after that was, now having said that, my lawyers always say to me, "Oh, yes, you do care about them."
Right. Okay.
And he said, when I ran into this guy on the street, and he said, I've heard from your lawyers, I thought you liked bootlegs, and he said, yeah, but you got caught. So in a way, he's having it both ways. But we know that personally he likes them. John liked them too. I mean, John was on the radio talking about them. I mean, he got his copy of Yellow Matter Custard from Dave Morell as in an interesting trade where he gave Dave a butcher cover slip of the Slick. And drew a picture on it and signed it to him in exchange for Yellow Matter Custard. So which was
that was a no-brainer there. I think
that was a good deal for Dave.
that was definitely a good deal for Dave. Yeah. He talked about that when he was with us way back. But
So, what we decided to do was we would each pick 5, and we would mix it up, solo and group, and we're going to go around. And I thought I'd start with Steve because I know he's probably chosen some of the same ones as me.
but we should say that we're picking our 5 favorites.
Oh, right, yeah,
not necessarily what we think are the best, and they could actually end up being the same.
Yeah,
for some of us anyway.
Yeah.
Right. So,
well, that's the thing. I find it really hard to pick favorites at this point because there are so many of them out there, and they keep improving. And I have like several hundred favorites. But in my case, I was trying to pick something that would represent a broad array of stuff. So they're favorites, but they're not necessarily, what I would take to a desert island. But why don't we start with Steve? Steve, what were yours?
All right, let me start with. I'm rummaging through my pile here. The first one I picked was the Beatles Get Back, and there's a lot of versions of this, but this is the master disc, 2-disc master disc version that has both the Get Back album and the Rooftop concert, plus a little booklet on the inside. It's the best sounding version of this that I've seen. I believe this is Japanese, but yeah, it's the best sounding one I'm aware of. So that's one. Let's see. Okay, I'm just going to not go in any order here. I'm just going to, because I do have solo and group. Two John Lennon ones here. Listen to this radio show, which has the full Dennis Elsis interview, which is one of my favorite interviews of him when he's doing that, just rapping on the radio. I love that. I think that's fantastic. And then a 2-disc set of the full Lennon Rolling Stone interview, which, as I recall, this was the first time it came out. Rolling Stone didn't put it out themselves until well after this came out.
I believe that was a Darth disc, wasn't it?
It may have been. It doesn't say Darth on it.
Okay,
but I believe
there was a four CD Darth disc version. It came in 2 volumes.
Right. That's what this is.
Okay.
This is, and yeah, it has 2 Rolling Stone covers for the artwork. Is that the one you're talking about?
Yeah.
I wasn't aware we were doing interviews, including that, because all of mine are music.
Okay. Well, I just picked my favorites, but
but those Darth disc guys are so cool.
Yes, they are. They definitely are. They definitely are. Another one is next one is like the Lennon one is too, and this is a homegrown set. Not that I didn't do it. It was traded around. It's called The Songs We Were Singing. It was a 4-disc set of original songs that they had of songs they had done. So the original of I'm looking at the back here. Mailman, Bring Me No More Blues by Buddy Holly. What Am I Living For by Chuck Willis. I mean, there's a whole bunch of putting on the original Putting on the Style by Lonnie Donegan. And Dream Baby by Roy Orbison. So there are others like this too. And there's another one that I have that I can't remember the name of. Go ahead.
There's one that has way superseded that one called Dustbin Prophecies.
Oh, yes.
And Dustbin Prophecies has they have found everything any of the Beatles covered or mentioned, I think, and they've got the originals of all of those things. So I think they took the songs we were singing and sort of ran with the idea. I think Dustbin Prophecies is pretty much an online only thing. I've never seen discs of it,
I wouldn't be surprised if you can find it in Japan. But,
yeah, probably.
But yeah, I've never seen anything but it online.
So am I gathering from these 2 boots, Songs We Were Singing and Dustbin Prophecies, he's also included songs that the Beatles didn't release, but they also did live?
Yeah.
Like the songs that Mark Lewison mentioned in the Beatles Live?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. All right.
Yeah, I could run down they've got the originals of the Decca covers, like Three Cool Cats, September in the Rain, Take Good Care of My Baby, Crying, Waiting, Hoping, Chic of Araby. I mean, they're each of the discs are different. So, and in fact, this is a 4-disc set, and each of the 4 discs has pictures of each Beatle on a single Beatle on each of the covers. Okay,
that's a great idea.
Yeah, it is. Let's see the last 2. I'm gonna save my favorite for last. The one I have to mention, and the one that when we first started talking about this subject, I said I have to mention, is the original ultra rare tracks.
Mm-hmm.
Those, you can't say enough about those. I mean, they were redone in many different versions. John C. Wynne put a book out about the Barrett tapes. There is a Barrett tape file with all the listings in it that you can find around. That's a very good research tool. But the ultra rare tracks on Trademark Equality, actually Swinging Pig, were. I remember when they came out, everybody was freaking out. I mean, they were just absolutely stunning. They were redone originally right around that time as Backtrack.
Yeah.
And put. And then they were redone again and again and again. They were there's been several versions of these things, but that's one that really spurred, a lot of what has come out. It came out after. It spurred the anthology because that came out before the anthology, and I remember hearing at the time that I believe it was George Harrison was furious that those things had leaked. But anyway.
Yeah.
I
think what was stunning was the fact that it was board quality.
Right.
Yeah.
That was
of all the stuff. And after years and years of hearing inferior quality material, which is fascinating in its own way, to hear it as perfect as you possibly can was just, it shocked a lot of people.
Right. I mean, I think what we had before that, the only thing we'd had before that of that kind of quality was the Decca tape. And everything else was either concert recordings, which some of which were, board recordings, but they had the audience all over them. And otherwise, BBC, which in a lot of cases, I think in most cases at that time, were from tapes people recorded off the air and not always very well. So these things really were a revelation because they were studio outtakes in stereo, or I should say raw 2-track in a lot of cases. And it took years for the whole batch to come out because, the story behind it is really a relationship between John Barrett, who was an EMI engineer who, when he was diagnosed with cancer, EMI, I guess, asked him what his dream job would be, and it was to catalog all the Beatles stuff. So it was his job to do that before Mark Lewison came along. He never finished. In fact, he didn't actually get that far. I mean, he wrote these lists of what was on tapes, but no real notes or analysis that I've seen anyway. And so then they hired Mark to do that job. But he was pals with a DJ named Roger Scott. Both these guys are dead. So, there's nothing, we're not pointing the international copyright police in anyone's direction because they'll never find them. But Roger Scott, in his professional capacity, was putting together Beatles-related radio shows, and some material he got from John Barrett actually got on those shows. You listen to, there was one called Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, which is how long was it? Like a 9 or 10 week series. And, just in the middle of nowhere, you'll play, We Can Work It Out, and it has a count in and it doesn't fade out. A lot of these things, you're sort of listening to the show and suddenly, hey, that's a raw studio tape. And so Roger Scott had an awful lot of the John Barrett material, and after he died, a lot more of it began coming out. So I think we have it all now.
Yeah. And the other thing to mention is that at the time when these things came out, a lot of those tracks that were in stereo on the bootlegs were in mono. Had not been released in stereo. So that was the real. What do you mean? Well, I mean, a lot of those early tracks were in stereo. The Beatles tracks. Right. Yeah. So and they weren't in stereo on the CDs.
Oh, on the official CDs, but on the albums, you get LPs, you could get them. And, yeah.
Right.
The great thing about them was they showed how the tracks were made, and they had the count-ins, and they had, you could reconstruct how I Saw Her Standing There was made, with the edit of the count-in onto the finished track, and then you heard the clapping overdubs. It really was great stuff for anybody who is curious in a scholarly way about how the Beatles did what they did.
And the Sessions bootleg album preceded this, and after hearing that, I mean, that was a big attraction. That was very popular for a while. I mean, this was just fantastic, and you get to hear some real changes in the development of the tracks, like She's a Woman, for example. And I'm Looking Through You is another one.
Yeah.
So anyway, my final choice, and I was going through the stuff and I was going, oh, I have to pull this one, is George Harrison, Beware of Abco. I absolutely, and I had not heard that until today. I hadn't listened to it in several years, and I put it on today, and it was like, oh my God, what a beautiful disc that is, and that's something that should be released.
So remind our listeners what it covers.
It's all acoustic. It's mostly acoustic, I should say, and covers the All Things Must Pass sessions, Run of the Mill, Art of Dying, Everybody, Nobody, Wah Wah, Window. And I remember I was listening to it before we started, and he talks about, well, this is a new song. It's called Beware of Darkness, and I need a few more words for it.
Yeah.
So some of this stuff was in development. Most of it is acoustic. There are some tracks with electric guitar. There were bootlegs that came out of the All Things Must Pass sessions with alternate versions in excellent quality. But for my, this one's better as far as I'm concerned.
Well, this was really meant to give to Phil Spector so that he would know the new material that George had written.
Right.
And you had mentioned a few titles there, Steve, like Window, Window. There were a handful of songs there that he didn't release at all.
That's right.
So it's nice to hear those. Whether or not you think they're as good as what turned up on All Things Must Pass, I probably feel that they're inferior. Although there's one called Cosmic Empire that I think you could have worked on a little bit. But it's actually one of my top 5.
Mine too, in a different version. But yeah.
Oh, okay.
Okay. So Ken, what were your 5 picks? What were your 5 picks down there in Connecticut? Down there from
this is strictly a Connecticut thing.
Ah.
Okay.
Nobody else feels this way except the people in Connecticut.
People in the Nutmeg State.
Okay.
Well, first of all, I'm not going to say that these are all in order, although what I rank at number 1 is my number 1 favorite bootleg. But just to give you an idea of what I personally find the most fascinating, when it comes to bootlegs, there's nothing like an unreleased song. And then there's always, of course, alternate takes, different mixes, demos. They're all fascinating in their own way, but I always kind of, though not always, rate unreleased songs as being the most important. Sometimes even a weak song that's unreleased can be more interesting than an alternate take that's not that much different than all the other takes that are out there. So for me, anything that has a lot of unreleased material in terms of actual songs that have never come out, those are the ones that I tend to gravitate to. Not saying that they're the best, but they're the ones that I return to the most and listen to the most. So at number 5, I had to just group together all the Lost Lennon tape material because there is so much that they played in the radio show that I loved, especially all the unreleased songs. And there were, I don't know, maybe a half dozen to a dozen unreleased songs or songs that were prototypes that led to the finished songs. And I love listening to all that stuff. In particular, the songs that John wrote for a proposed musical. So we've heard of the Ballad of John and Yoko. There are songs that were grouped in that late 70s, 1977 period. Sally and Billy, She Was a Friend of Dorothy's.
Tennessee.
Songs like those. Those songs I find fascinating, especially, Free as a Bird was that period too. Real Love. Was late 70s. So all these songs that you hear it as demos or just John on the piano or just John on guitar, and then you say to yourself, could he have developed these songs more? Are these songs that, had he lived, he would have come back to or used parts of, which he was known to do? So I find that whole thing fascinating, and the Lost Lennon tapes was the best thing to me that ever happened on the radio week by week. There was always some surprise of something you never heard before, in addition to all the alternate takes of John's solo material and interview clips and different mixes of songs. So they put out a whole slew of bootlegs of the Lost Lennon tapes material without Elliot Mintz's voice, just the songs themselves. And I collected all the ones that were on vinyl and eventually some of them on CD. And I treasure those. I always go back to them.
You are speaking, of course, of the set on Bag Records, I believe, right?
Yes.
Okay.
And wouldn't you agree they're all?
Absolutely. And I believe it was Volume 9 of the Bag Records set was the first time we got our hands on the whole run of Escher demos.
Okay.
So
it's
that was...
mention that.
Oh, okay.
You did that on purpose, Alan.
No, I really didn't.
Right into that.
No, I didn't.
Okay. Well, one of my other top 5 are the White Album demos. And I love them so much because they all fit so rather nicely together as one package. You get the feeling that they were all there at George's bungalow in Esher, Ken Fawn's, and they all did it in one day together in the same room. You get that feeling about it. And what I love about this collection of songs is, well, first of all, even though many of the songs on the White Album were acoustic anyway, it's nice to have acoustic versions of songs that were primarily electric, like back in the USSR, for example. And then, in addition to the White Album songs, you also know that they had written songs that eventually turned up on Abbey Road, like Me, Mr. Mustard, and Polythene Pam. And then there are the songs that they released in their solo careers, like Jealous Guy and Junk, or Sing Along Junk. Those songs. And then a song like Sour Milk Sea is in there too. So whenever I think of those titles, as much as I know the release versions, I always bring it back to the demo that it first came out in. And one particular favorite of mine happens to be a song that George released on his own, and that's Circles. And while I love the version that George put out on his own, the one that was the demo has a very different, moody, dark feel to it, because I think they used a harmonium or some kind of organ on that, and it gave it such a different feel from the version that George released. So I like this whole collection, presenting it all together as one. And as we discussed, as far as upcoming projects that the Beatles would put out and Universal would put out, it's a natural that the White Album should be next year. And I can't see how they can avoid putting out the White Album demos. And we've talked about this before several times, and the 5 demos that they put on the anthology sounded so crystal clear, and those were from George's own collection, whereas the bootlegs that have come out, I think, were John's personal collection.
Right. They were a mono cassette dub, basically, from George's tape, which is stereo.
Yeah, okay.
So we really need George's.
Imagine if we got all those songs in that kind of quality. That would be heaven, you know.
It would be.
The only thing I found a problem with these demos is that it sounded like, in many cases, they were trying to overdub what they had already recorded. And so, like, Obla Di Obla Da, it's not in sync, you know, the different takes vocally. So, you know, that's the only problem I have with the White Album demos, but I love them for that reason. I love, you know, every aspect about those demos.
So which boot of those do you prefer, or are you going with the one in the Lost Lennon tape set?
I think it was the Yellow Dog one.
Okay.
And the quality's not all that great throughout the whole thing, but it's still fascinating to listen to.
Yeah.
Okay. Also, as Steve had said, beware of ABKCO, for the very same reasons that Steve gave. Great material, all things must pass material, and in fact, some of it actually became available commercially because Let It Down was put on the remaster for All Things Must Pass. I think Beware of Darkness was too. I mean, that version of it. But there's nothing quite like John, Paul, or George with an acoustic guitar alone in perfect sound quality. And, you know, I've said it before, I just love the sound of George on an acoustic guitar. And sometimes, and especially in the case of All Things Must Pass, where, and I love Phil Spector's production, despite the fact that a lot of people are anti-Spector these days. Even George himself felt, you know, later on, shortly before he died, that he felt that it was maybe a bit overdone. There's such a drastic difference when you just hear George on an acoustic guitar compared to what came out on All Things Must Pass. But I love the contrast there of the two. They're just great on their own, just as you can say that with the White Album demos. Also, my number 2 is Pizza and Fairy Tales. This was a double disc of material from Paul, which was about one CD was about outtakes of press-to-play material, and then it was more songs from that period. The period in between Press-to-Play and Flowers in the Dirt, when he was working with Phil Ramone. And some of those songs eventually trickled out commercially.
The This One demo.
The This One demo that Paul just put on his website as an exclusive download is from that.
Right.
It was originally on that. But there's a lot of songs from that period that I love so much, especially Return to Pepperland, which I think should have been released for the 20th anniversary at that time of Sgt. Pepper. I think that's just got such a great hook to it. Once I have that song in my head, I can't get it out. Although Alan seems to think he interprets that differently than I do. when you have a song stuck in your head.
Well, if it's a good one, Ken.
Well, I still think that if you have a song stuck in your head, you have to like it. But anyway, I love Return to Pepperland. So many songs from that period came out as bonus tracks on the Flaming Pie CD singles. One particular song called Love Mix, which is another really catchy song. A lot of his danceable stuff, Atlantic Ocean, was from that time period. Love Come Tumbling Down. A lot of those songs. And I like hearing them all in one collection. There was a lot of material that he did not release. And part of the fun in listening to all these bootlegs is, whether it's Beatles or solo, you might say to yourself, why didn't they put this out? This was good enough to come out as it was. And, Once Upon a Long Ago was actually from that period anyway. Loveliest Thing was from that period. The original Beautiful Night, which we talked about in our last show, which actually had some members of Billy Joel's band, Liberty DeVito, playing drums on it. That's on there. So I love that whole collection, and I like all the alternate takes of songs from Press to Play as well. So there's just so much material being a 2 CD set that I had to include that one in my top 5. And my number 1 bootleg of all the bootlegs out there has got to be Cold Cuts. Cold Cuts, to me, we heard so much about Paul proposing this album of unreleased songs and B-sides, and there are different versions that have come out through the years of Cold Cuts. But I remember getting the first one, sticking mainly to that one, and because of the fact that there were 12 songs on there, and all of those songs at that time, I believe, had not been released at all, although we'd heard My Carnival on bootleg before that, though not in the same quality. And I believe we also, we heard Waterspout, too, on a bootleg called Suitable for Framing, although it wasn't the full version of Waterspout, which was an unreleased song from London Town. All these songs, to me, are worthy of release. I'm not saying that they're all worthy of being on albums. Maybe some of them were B-sides. There was a live recording of a song called Best Friend, which dates back to 1972 when Paul played Europe with Wings. I like the song. It's not the greatest live song I think Paul's ever done, but it could be a B-side. All this stuff really was worthy of coming out. Waterspout, I know so many people when they heard Waterspout said, why on earth didn't he put that on London Town? Same thing with A Love for You, which was from the Ram sessions, and eventually he put that out on the remastered Ram. And some of the songs have been released on CD singles, like Mama's Little Girl and Same Time Next Year. But it's a lot of revelations on this entire album. And Cage is another favorite, comes from the Back to the Egg sessions. Really catchy song that could have fit nicely on that album. And, sometimes it's fun to listen to all this unreleased stuff and try to understand, if it's at all possible, why the Beatles or any of them individually chose not to release this. And in the case of Paul, there's so much unreleased stuff.
Yeah.
And I'm sure so many people who listen to this show would question why on earth he didn't put out some of these songs legitimately. And they probably will turn up on later remasters. I can't imagine London Town coming out with that Waterspout, for example. And you keep hearing rumors that he's going to put out a box set of unreleased stuff. I don't know if that'll ever happen. I think he's saving it all for the remasters. But if you don't want to wait for the remasters and you still want to dig and try and find stuff he hasn't released, Cold Cuts is one that, is an excellent start because it really represents a lot of unreleased music throughout the 70s from him.
Okay, so there are 1 billion different pressings of Cold Cuts and several different, actually, originals of Cold Cuts that McCartney compiled. So which are you recommending?
Well, the first one. I think I only got a second or 2 or 3 of them.
What label, in other words?
Okay, let me get my CD out.
Sorry.
Sometimes I don't remember the labels, but what does it say here? Peg Boy.
Okay.
Yeah. Oh, by the way, I should mention the song Tragedy. One of my favorite unreleased McCartney songs, which dates back to the Red Rose Speedway sessions, but it's a cover The Thomas Wayne hit, and the Fleetwoods also had a hit with it. He did a fantastic job. I love the whole arrangement of Tragedy, especially using a sitar on that song. That's another one. I hear that and I say, why didn't it come out on Red Rose Speedway?
Mm-hmm.
So probably will be on the remaster for Red Rose Speedway, I would think.
Right.
But we'll see. But those are my top 5.
Well, as we know, Red Rose Speedway was originally going to be a double album. They actually did acetates of the whole thing, and EMI wanted it to be a single album. So lots of outtakes from that because of that.
Sure.
So, okay, that is a good bunch of stuff. That makes it my turn, right? Are you done?
Yep.
Okay, so my turn. And I might as well start with Ringo, since he has gotten no love tonight. Might as well give Ringo some respect by choosing at least one of his. And there were several that I was juggling. One of them was the Memphis unreleased album, which is about half of a CD of the Chips Moman production from 1987. And then there is the original Can't Fight Lightning, which more or less became Stop and Smell the Roses. But I decided instead to go with a general compilation of all kinds of different stuff called Riz Off. Weird title. A lot of Ringo bootlegs have weird titles. And Riz Off has, it's really a hodgepodge, but it's a great hodgepodge. It includes everything from a bunch of his Sun Country wine cooler ads to lots of TV show appearances. When he appeared on Saturday Night Live and did a medley with Billy Crystal, who was playing Sammy Davis Jr., that is on here. And it's pretty funny, and it sort of brought back to mind that whole appearance of his, which I thought was great. That was on, I would say, 1985 or so? 84,
around
85, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
There are some studio outtakes, like there's a 5-minute version of Dead Giveaway with Ringo and Ron Wood. The one on Can't Fight Lightning is only 3 minutes, something around 3:49. There are 2 demos of Goodnight Vienna with Ringo and John. There's some Honey Don't and Matchbox from the Carl Perkins special, and Cilla Black and Ringo singing Act Naturally on BBC. So a couple of alternate versions of It Don't Come Easy, an alternate version of 6 O'Clock. So there's really a lot of really good stuff on here, and it jumps back and forth from period to period, but I find it a very, as Paul said when we were talking about bootlegs, charismatic compilation. So that's Ringo. For George, I can probably save us a little time because I'm also pretty much going with Beware of APCO, but I'm using a different version. I'm using the version that came out on a label called Silent Seas. Now, Silent Seas is one of the many labels that sort of basically repackages things that have been bootlegged elsewhere, but does it in either an expanded or, more chronologically suitable way. And, so they've done sets of all the Beatles outtakes and lots of live stuff and everything. They did one called Let It Down. Let It Down, and the first part of it is basically the demo tape that we were discussing just before when we talked about Beware of APCO. So this version, Let It Down, also goes on to include basically an acoustic jam with Phil Spector and George. I think Phil Spector is doing a lot of the singing, but they run through all kinds of stuff. Save the Last Dance for Me, You Better Move On, Down in the Valley, Let's Play House, Bluebirds Over the Mountain, Smokey Joe's Cafe Leaning on a Lamppost. And it's, that isn't the most stellar listening, but it's kind of fun. The main thing here is the bunch of demos, which, as you guys said, are really just brilliant and should be released. So that's George. Paul, I have a little problem because my first choice was Pizza and Fairy Tales.
Sorry.
Sorry. And I thought when Ken was talking about pizza and fairy tales, I thought, okay, that's fine. I'll just do cold cuts instead. So, but that's not going to work either. Having said that, there are many, many different versions of cold cuts. I mean, McCartney himself prepared 3 versions of it when he was considering releasing it. One in 78, one in 80, and then one in, I think, about 86 or 87. And then the next thing we heard about it was in 1989 when he did his press conference at the Lyceum Theater in New York, and someone asked about unreleased stuff, and he said, well, I made this album called Cold Cuts, but it's been bootlegged so much that I'm not going to put it out. But there are a number of bootlegs of this, including one on Secret Garden, which I believe is another name that Silent Seas goes under. And they put on the 1978 version, the 1980 version, what they call the mid-80s version, which is 86 or 87, and then they have an extra version. And basically, one of the great things about this version of Cold Cuts is that they annotate every track. They say, where it's from, what mix it is, and the thing is that McCartney's running order on Cold Cuts was pretty similar for the 3 versions, but he kept going back and remixing or adding a new vocal or adding a new something else, for this book that will eventually be coming out, although not the first volume, of course. We talked to Richard Niles, who was an arranger who Paul McCartney used, and he did some arranging for Love for You. So that was in the mid-'80s, I believe, and so the earlier versions are different than the one he did. And a lot of these tracks have changed a lot over the years, and the Secret Garden version kind of, brings them all together. You can compare each one to the next one and the next one for 4 different versions. So Ken, that's the one for you.
Okay. I will definitely look into that.
Okay.
It gets confusing, all these different mixes.
It really does. So for John, I'm pretty much of the same mind as Ken too, but I have a specific project that I'm thinking of, or 2 versions of this specific project. One was called Between the Lines. It is a 9 CD set and 1 DVD of all of the demos, all of the home demos that John recorded between 1975 and 1980. So it has all those songs that Ken mentioned, and a lot of them were sourced from the Lost Lennon Tapes discs. And other things have gotten out various ways. But there is another version which I got but have not yet been able to spend any time with, which is a set called Complete Home Demo Recordings 1975 to 1980 on the Mr. Claudel label, and that is 10 discs. So,
wow.
And I noticed that there were a couple of takes of certain things, like, for instance, they're in different order, so it's hard to find them. But I found that one seemed to have 1 or 2 extra takes of certain songs that weren't on the Between the Lines version. So, Mr. Claudel is another one of those labels that sort of repackages things that have been out elsewhere. And, basically there are very few labels these days that put out brand new stuff. Basically HMC, which also goes under the name Trademark of Quality, is a age-old bootleg name, but it's different people, is doing a lot of stuff that hasn't been out before. Mr. Claudel kind of then picks those things up shortly after either, HMC or someone else puts them out and recompiles them. And sometimes they do a really good job. A lot of people are down on Mr. Claudel for that reason, but they put them in order. They often sound quite good, and they have this slightly expanded version of these Lennon home demos. So I'm just mentioning those. I haven't heard them yet. Okay, and my number 1 choice is the latest version of the many versions of the Beatles' BBC recordings called the BBC Archives. It was put together by someone who goes under the name Lord Reith, who is a historical name from the BBC history, and is not the actual Lord Reith, who I believe is long, long dead. But this version took, there have been many iterations of the BBC recordings on Pyramid, on Great Dane. Great Dane was the first really great set, of them, and then Purple Chick did them with some stuff that wasn't on Great Dane, and Yellow Dogs had a version. Basically, Lord Reith has taken all of the best of those, found the best quality, got some stuff that hadn't been bootlegged before. All told, the audio version, and I think there was a DVD that came with this set too, the audio version is 24 discs worth of BBC stuff. On my playlist, that is 935 tracks. Now, a lot of that is, he did separate, if Brian Matthews talking, so the Brian Matthew introduction is a track, and then the Beatles performance is a track. And there are some shows where he had the whole show, including some other performers, and so they're on too, although there's not that much of that on this version of the set. There's a little. But, it's great quality. It's the fullest version of these things that we have, and the best quality versions. And this is the set to have if you want the BBC material. And this is the set that EMI or Universal should just put out. Stop putting out little 2-disc compilations. They're really nice, but just do the real job, in a lot of cases, I compared some of these with the things that Universal put out, and in some cases the intros are edited, so it's an intro and it may not matter, but you're really not getting the full sense of what was said and what was heard by the original audience. You're getting a sort of truncated version. And so, this sort of leads me to another point about bootlegs, is that bootleggers are interested there are all kinds of bootleggers and they have different philosophies, but generally speaking, the best of them are interested in putting out exactly what it is, what it was, how it was recorded in the best quality, whereas an official label is more interested in a sort of artistic production. And if they think that this introduction is 4 words too long, they'll cut out the 4 words. I just as soon hear it as it happens,
Right.
So that's what you find on the BBC archive set from Lord Reith.
Well, they should probably release both versions, because the first Live at the BBC double disc was tremendous the way it was, the way that they packaged all the songs together. And for me, the biggest attraction with the BBC material are all the songs that they covered that they didn't release.
Right.
Plus I'll Be On My Way. And you had most of them on that first compilation.
Right.
So for people, there may be a lot of Beatle fans out there that love them but don't want to hear every single, every song, every version of it, and all the dialogue in between.
Right. These people should be re-educated. No, and also the other thing about this is that it's everything chronologically. Like, there are some shows we're missing, but basically they start with, Dream Baby. Actually, they start with the news report from that broadcast and the introduction of Dream Baby, which is the first thing they played on the BBC, and they go chronologically right through every show. And that, too, it shows you a development, and it shows you how far into their recording career they were still going on the BBC and playing these tracks that they were not recording for EMI, those old covers, in many different versions that are, not carbon copies of each other. And some of them are live shows with an audience in the BBC studios. So you hear some clapping, but it's not like crazy like in the concerts. So yeah, but go again.
Yeah, it's fascinating to me in particular that they did a song like "I Forgot to Remember to Forget," and that was in 1964.
Right.
and they hadn't released that on their own albums,
Right.
and that was fairly late in the game there.
Mhm.
So, they could have easily have just plugged their own records at that point, but they still were giving the BBC material that they hadn't released.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah, it's sort of like an extraordinary alternate career of the Beatles. I mean, all the hits are there up to 65 anyway, but there's this whole bunch of extra stuff that, they just never released. I mean, until the compilations came out. Yeah, the compilations are great. I mean, they're fine. They're a lot of fun, but this is this is really the real thing. And for me, it's what I picked as a fave. But there's ultra rare tracks and all those others. So many of the live recordings, Hollywood Bowl original recordings, the Shea Stadium concert with the actual soundtrack of what was recorded. There's so much great stuff out there, and so we've chosen our 5 each, and there's enough for us to do another show one day, maybe next year. We'd be happy to hear what everybody has to say if you want to write us in and tell us what your faves are. And
I have one quick question.
Sure.
Since we mentioned ultra rare tracks, and we were talking about the fact that it was the first time that we had this kind of board quality and many takes of the same song, no one has mentioned sessions.
No, I did actually. I yeah, I did when we were talking when near the end there. I kind of snuck it in, but yeah, no, that was quite a interesting little album. I played that thing to death. I loved it.
I had been commissioned to write liner notes for that.
Really?
Yeah. So, maybe we should do a show on Sessions one of these days, although everything on it came out on the anthology, basically.
Right.
Right.
But I had been commissioned to write a set of liner notes, and it ended up being sort of a turf war between British EMI and Capitol, and Britain wanted Brian Southall to write them. There are notes signed by Brian Southall on the original bootleg, but he claims that they have nothing to do with his notes. But the upside was that in the transaction, I said to their representative, who was a guy named John Carter, who was originally in the Strawberry Alarm Clock, but he was the American delegate to the International Beatles Committee. And he came to New York, and we were going to meet and talk about these notes. And I said, well, you really have to give me a copy of this if I'm going to write the notes. And he took out a very fancy metal cassette and said, okay, here you go, you can copy it. And my setup had a cassette player and an open reel. So I threaded up an open reel, and he said, oh, come on, at least have the decency to copy it to cassette. And I said, well, as you see, there's one cassette player. And he said, well, okay. So I got a copy. The version he played me was a little bit different than the one that was bootlegged. Because at that point, it was not yet, I'm not sure if it was called Sessions yet. It originally was going to be called Beatles Boots.
Really?
They're going to have the 4 boots, this on the cover. And then they thought, well, that's not a good message to send. So then they were going to call it 1, 2, 3, 4. There are no count-ins to any songs on that record, but they were going to call it 1, 2, 3, 4, and someone wisely argued that that's not good either, so it became Sessions. And the version he played was a little bit different. I'm not sure the bootlegged version had the Christmas Time Is Here Again on the beginning and end. That was one thing mine had, because it was supposed to come out around Christmas originally. And I had basically argued, are you telling me that you're putting those on here just because this is going to come around Christmas? I mean, you should just put the whole track as a separate track in there, which they didn't do. But I think they then took the Christmas bits off. And yeah, it was a very weird time. Then finally they ended up not putting it out at all, as you know. I mean, it became a football in that Beatles versus EMI lawsuit that wasn't settled until 1989. And then when it was settled, there was no point in putting out sessions because they were already talking about doing what became the anthology.
Mm-hmm.
So
that was pretty important for its time. It really was.
Yeah.
Who killed it, though? It was the Beatles that killed it, right?
Yeah. Basically, the Beatles argued that EMI didn't have the right to put out any unreleased stuff, and EMI argued that, yes, indeed, we do have the right to put out unreleased stuff, but it became a bargaining chip. And that is why, in the 1989 agreement, one of the provisions was that EMI could not put out anything without the approval of Apple. And that included not just unreleased stuff, but even compilations like love songs. The only thing they initially agreed to allowing out were the red and blue compilations. But no love songs, no rock and roll music, no Hollywood Bowl even, originally. And so, they've revisited things over the years, obviously, which is why we have Hollywood Bowl now. But that was the agreement at the time.
Wow.
So I should hasten to say that my tape did not become the bootleg of Sessions.
Well, one other question then is your tape. I assume that your tape is better quality than the bootleg, right?
Could be. But it's irrelevant now because those things are all on Anthology.
That's true.
So
that's true. Okay.
Yeah. Huh.
So
well, it was exciting at the moment because you got to hear "Leave My Kitten Alone" and those songs.
Oh yeah,
that means a lot.
Although,
Got Trouble.
Yeah, I'd heard those before anyway because of there was a bootleg called, what was it called, Steve? There was a bootleg.
I know the one you're talking about, and I can't think of it off the top of my head.
File Under.
Right.
Oh yeah.
Right.
And if you recall, in the summer of 1984, Scott Muni somehow got his hands on a really good quality of "Leave My Kitten Alone" and played it on WFM a number of times before they stopped him. Anyway,
that also reminds me that KFRC here in San Francisco played "How Do You Do It" several times. Mm-hmm. I don't remember what year it was, but I do remember them playing it because I remember driving around to hear it.
Yeah.
I was determined to. I think I was still living at home then, and the only way I was going to hear it was in my car. So I drove around.
Well, that was released on bootleg in the early '70s, around the same time as the Decagon singles that were the Decca audition tape recordings. So that was around. NEW played that once in, I think, 1972 when they had a Beatles A to Z and they got up to H, and there was "How Do You Do It?" And I said, "What? Whoa! I don't have that. I have to get that." And how a bootleg collector was born.
Oh, it started with that one song?
No, not really. It started. It probably started when Dave Morell went on to Howard Smith's show after one of the John Lennon interviews and brought along Yellow Matter Custard and probably what was called Whiskey Flats at the time, and and played a bunch of these things. And I thought, wow, okay, those things are out there. Gotta have them.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I remember where I used to see them. There was a place in downtown San Jose that I used to be able to walk to from San Jose State that people in the area will know. I won't mention the name of the show. The shop. It's long gone now, but they had them sitting right out in the rack, right facing the street. Mm-hmm. There, and I remember seeing the BBC. I remember seeing Yellow Matter Custard there. Wow. Way back. That was the beginning.
Okay, so that was a lot of fun going through some of those things that are semi-illicit. Actually, from the record industry's point of view, totally illicit, but really great stuff that tells us a lot about the Beatles and are also just a lot of fun to listen to. So I think if you want to contact us. We can be reached at thingswesaidtodayradioshow@gmail.com. We've been getting an increasing amount of mail, and we answer it when we can. And feel free to comment or suggest things or argue things, whatever you want to do. You can also find us on Twitter at @thingswesaidfab. And we have a Facebook page, Things We Said Today, Beatles Radio Fans. And we can be reached individually as well. I can be reached on Facebook at either Alan Kozin or Alan Kozin Remixed. And Steve, how about you?
I can be reached on my personal page, and I also have a Beatles group called Beatles News and Information, and my email is BeatlesExaminer@gmail.com.
Okay, and Ken, you have undoubtedly some contests and things coming up this week on your own page and show?
Well, on my website, kenmichaelsradio.com, I have my weekly Beatles trivia, and every single week you can win one of 9 great prizes, like CDs, DVDs, and books. That's every week. That goes without saying. But I do want to say that last week I had the pleasure of interviewing Brian Ray for about an hour discussing his work with Paul McCartney. Brian has been in Paul's touring band since 2002, playing guitar and bass. So we talk about that. We talk about being on Paul's studio albums. We also talk about his relatively new album from his band called the Bayonets. Mm-hmm. And it really is a terrific album. We've talked about this before. It's got great rock and roll on it, strong R&B, lots of great guitar hooks. We talk about that, and there's quite a bit about Brian working with McCartney on there. So if you can, it's on the interviews page 4 page. If you go to the tab that says More Interviews, you go to the drop-down menu, look for Interviews page 4, and it's the interview right at the top of the page. Brand new interview with Brian Ray. And if you want to email me, my address is everylittlething@att.net.
Okay, and if you are just interested in the history of bootlegs generally, not particularly the Beatles, in fact, the Beatles aren't really that well covered in it, there is a book called Bootleg by Clinton Halen that is a fairly interesting read, and he interviews a lot of the early bootleggers and sets the history pretty straight. So there's that. So, thanks for joining us, and for Ken Michaels and Steve Marinucci, I'm Alan Kozin, and we will see you next time.